What up, YouTube? What you guys are seeing here is the product of 23 forma and several hundred hours of experimenting. Any sane person may ask, why would you do something so ridiculous? But alas, let me enlighten you on what I like to call the lazy man Saryn build, or in other words, the easiest way I have found to play Saryn in level cap void cascade without having to spam molt every 2 seconds to shield gate or overly rely on your teammates to buff you. Now, before we dive into the build, the biggest reason I use this setup is due to a really annoying mechanic that you can face when swapping to your operator. As seen in this clip, your Warframe can actually die very easily when you're in your operator despite having 90% damage reduction because of how much damage the enemies start doing as you enter very high enemy levels. That being said, there are ways around this, such as placing your Warframe in creative spots and trying to minimize time spent in the operator. Additionally, the Shade Companion can also be used to cloak your Warframe, but it's often inconsistent and relies on your Sentinel being alive. The most reliable way is to rolling guard before you go into operator, which is 3 seconds of invulnerability plus shield gate plus guardian from companion, which gives you 5+ seconds of free time. However, I found this to be inconvenient, as I now needed to make sure I always had my rolling guard up to switch to the operator, which limited my other uses for it. Also, keep in mind, this is assuming you're using Madurai, since technically you can use Vazaryn's ability called Guardian Shell to make yourself invulnerable, but then your amp damage is going to greatly suffer, which is why it's vastly recommended to use Madurai in Void Cascade. So enough yapping, let's get on with how the build works. First things first, the bread and butter of the build is Quiver, which is the skill you get from putting Ivara in the Helminth. The idea behind Quiver in this build is that it can be used in 2 ways. The first way is by shooting the floor and standing in its bubble. This is the lazier way to go about the build, but it's also more reliable as the second method could be a bit inconvenient depending on how cluttered the room you're in is. The second method utilizes a pretty cool mechanic that needs to be used on a Sentinel, since land companions run around and away too much. It involves bullet jumping in a direction, turning your camera around, and shooting your own Sentinel with your Quiver arrow to allow your Sentinel to keep you invisible as you move around the map. This allows for a much more mobile play style at the cost of a bit more setup. Now, you may notice that your Invis will break if you move too fast away from your Sentinel. This is entirely determined by 2 factors, one being how fast you are moving, and the second being how much range your build has, as it affects the size of the invisibility bubble. In this build, Invis will only break for about a second at most if you are moving too fast, but it isn't enough time for enemies to target you, and it's usually when there are changes in elevation, such as jumping very high. The only trouble you could run into is if you're playing with a Wisp or a frame that boosts your movement speed even faster, in which case you either need to slow down your gameplay or increase your range to compensate by 1 mod at most. Now, onto the breakdown. With Molt augmented, we are able to reach the 200% ability strength threshold that is needed to give Spores a 100% status chance at applying Corrosive. Although this build is not very focused on Spores, it is still recommended to use them on enemies, as it helps a ton with stripping as fast as possible. Now, in case some of you are new to Saryn, here's a quick overview of her abilities. Spores, as we previously spoke about, are used to spread corrosive stacks to nearby enemies. Molt is used to cleanse statuses, provide increased movement speed, distract enemies, and explode into more damage. Toxic Lash is easily Saryn's best ability, in my opinion, since it gives all your weapons toxin damage without messing with status weight and spread spores. Lastly, Quiver is her replaced ability for Invis. Speaking of stripping, no, not that stripping. We also have Venom Dose, which adds corrosive damage to our weapons and our teammates' weapons, allowing us to not have to mod for corrosive and instead mod for viral. The rest of the build consists of brief respite and catalyzing shields for the occasional shield gate, in case we miss our arrows or get hit by AoEs. Rolling Guard, which could be swapped since we have Shield Gate and Invis, but I like it for the added survivability, particularly when I'm in a cluttered tileset and choose to use the stationary method since it lets me rotate between arrow spots safely. 3 duration mods, and a comfortable amount of energy through Primed Flow and Arcane Energize. As for the shards, besides the 2 necessary green shards to allow her spores and venom dose to fully strip through 14 stacks of corrosive, it depends on what you have available to you. Ideally, I would go with 1 more green shard for toxin damage to boost Toxic Lash. And the last shard is the most flexible as it would depend on if you're having any remaining energy issues or not. In my case, I tend to leave 1 shard for energy just to be safe, but it's certainly possible to slot something else. Next up is the Sentinel. We are using Worm Prime for 2 reasons here. The first is because I don't have Prime sure-footed, and the second is because it allows us to squeeze a bit more range out of our build through the Exilis slot. For those of you who didn't know, Negate also prevents knockdown. This Sentinel also isn't modded to shoot, as the gun it's on it is pretty meh, and I only use it due to its high critical chance to activate Tenacious Bond and to stack Vigilante mods. Now for the weapons. I typically make sure I have 1 AoE weapon and 1 single target weapon in all my builds. In this case, Torrid is my AoE weapon, but with a good Riven can be both. You can replace the Riven with Serration and have a similar build. You can also see that my Vigilante mod is getting benefited from the Vigilante mods I put on my Sentinel, so those are acting as a nice passive buff. As for the evolutions, these are the ones I use. Next up is my single target weapon. In this case, I'm using a crit Latum build since I'm not using Zada's Whisper to make full use of the alternative non-crit build. You can replace the Riven for a 60-60 Toxin mod to have a similar build. As a side note, I typically find it to be a hassle to use 2 Incarnon weapons since they both require charging. So while this loadout is very good in theory, I plan on just taking some primer instead with my Torrid since I don't charge my Latum often enough. And finally, the melee. I am using Praetos because we are only using the melee for Shattering Impact, as it's one of the best ways to strip acolytes. Praetos also gives us movement speed when we activate Incarnon form, so it's acting as a movement strip stick. This build is entirely based around attack speed to make Shattering activate sooner, and Dispatch for more movement speed, which is nice when moving between Exolizer rooms. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this build guide. Drop a like and comment if you guys want more content like this, and be sure to stop by the stream, as I'm live every day on Twitch under the username Novarix.